We are highly focused on the way that the U.S. continues to respond to the global pandemic, but an increasingly globalized take is pointing out some serious problems abroad when you look into how other governments around the world are adapting to crisis as well. And it's presenting a troubling trend for democracies around the globe. According to the NGO Freedom House, a new study reveals a, quote, stunning democratic breakdown, with the report showing a rise in China's and Russia's influence in Europe, growing with fewer democracies in the region than at any point since the mid-90s. And for more on how that could lead to destabilization around the globe in increasingly trying times, we're joined by Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations since 2003, as well as a former advisor to President George H.W. Bush as a member of his National Security Council, and the author of the new book, The World, A Brief Introduction. And Mr. Haass, it's a privilege to have you with us this afternoon. I want to jump right into your take on COVID-19. We'll get into the book in a second, because I think it's a great take on kind of a pretty simple to understand description of world affairs here. But obviously, before that book came to print, before you finish that, COVID-19 is now the main story here. I want to get your take on how that might accelerate destabilization in Europe, around the globe, as democracies struggle to basically monitor the problem on the coronavirus front.
Well, thank you. No, you're right. There's not just an economic recession in the world. There's also a democratic recession. We're seeing a real rollback over the last couple of decades of both on the number of countries that are democratic, perhaps even more important, the depth or strength of democracies where it already existed. And I think this crisis is actually going to place pressure on existing leadership, whether they're democratic or authoritarian. But people are going to demand of their government that it delivers, that it protects them physically, that it provides for them economically. And any government, be it democratic or non-democratic, that meets those tests will probably do just fine. And anyone that fails those tests will obviously, there'll be tremendous opposition. But you see democratic governments in places like South Korea, Germany, Japan, they are distinguishing themselves. And those leaders are enjoying tremendous popular support. But at the same time, you're seeing authoritarian governments in Russia and Iran doing terribly. So it seems to me the lesson to draw from this is less the nature of the system and more the quality of the leadership.
Well, the other question here, too, is how much you have in terms of power to respond to all this, as you do see economies around the globe start to suffer the consequences of either shutdown orders or just basic recession basically spilling over across the globe and hitting them there. We've seen economic problems lead to some pretty severe, I guess you could say, power struggles. You can look back to Germany, World War II, and what happened there. How big of a concern is it for you that some of these economic problems actually will lead to a worsening position for some of these democracies on the brink?
I worry about it around the world. A lot of countries simply don't have much cushion. But I'll be honest, I worry about it here too. I worry, some of the numbers you were talking, $40,000 a year, virtually no savings. How are they going to manage to navigate this, particularly? And I think it seems likely this is going to go on and stretch on for months. And even if there is a bit of a return to the workplace, my guess is a lot of those are going to have to be reversed, because there will be spikes or outbreaks of new infections. And at the moment, we don't have a society that is set up to provide a floor for that many people for that long. And something has to give. So either we will provide that floor, or we will have serious unrest, even in this country.
Well, I mean, we talked about how you served under the first President Bush. You also served under the second President Bush. So you have a pretty strong understanding here of Republican leadership. Curious to get your take on the way that President Donald Trump continues to grapple with assigning a sense of responsibility on China here, as he continues to point the finger in how that country responded to the crisis at the beginning of the pandemic. What's your take on maybe how he's trying to apply the pressure on President Xi Jinping?
Look, I think it's perfectly fair and reasonable to be critical of China for how it handled the outbreak. It obviously silenced public health experts. It didn't report things. It didn't cooperate with international authorities. It allowed people to leave Wuhan, which led to the spread of the virus. And even now, 4 months later, they're still not doing everything they should. But there's a limit to how much we can scapegoat them. This virus came to our shores 4 months ago. China can't be blamed for our lack of protective equipment. China can't be blamed for the debacle that continues to be testing. China can't be blamed for our inconsistent messaging or our undisciplined lack of social distancing. So again, I think it's fine to be critical of China for all sorts of reasons. But at some point, as the saying would go, physician, heal thyself. We need to look at what we're doing. Look, we can't stop globalization. That's not a choice. What is the choice is how we respond to it. And I would simply say, in this case, our response has not been close to adequate.
Yeah, and the response really is kind of, I guess you could say, I guess, a reaction to an increasingly shift in position to just say that we're going to be isolationist in the way that we're handling some of these things. But when you look at the response to kind of battling Russia's and China's reach in Europe and Asia, what's your take on the way that maybe the EU and the US could be working together to do more on that front to really battle the power rise in those regions?
Look, you raise a good point. And even though we're focused on this virus, the other set of problems hasn't gone away. Russia's still in Ukraine. They're still in Georgia. They're still in the Middle East. China's still trying to unilaterally change the status of the South China Sea. So the foreign policy challenges, we've got to deal with this new set of issues like pandemics, like climate change. At the same time, we deal with the old agenda. And there, again, we've got to figure out ways of deterring them to raise the costs of destabilizing aggressive behavior. So there's no solution to it. That's the stuff of history. But we've got to find ways to push back either directly with military force, indirectly with sanctions, maybe, and obviously one hopes that will create a context in which diplomacy can achieve something.
Yeah, you talk about the context here, and that's really the focus of your new book, The World, A Brief Introduction. And it's kind of a take in that you don't really talk too much about theory, a simple way to understand the problems that have been there for a while. What prompted you to kind of write this book, and what are you hoping to get out of it, maybe explaining some of these complex problems to people that might not have nearly as much expertise as you do in the matters?
Well, thanks for asking. Look, what prompted me to write this book is I thought we live at a moment where the world is obviously fundamentally important to the course of our lives. Just, anyone just need to look out the window with the pandemic or with climate or other issues. Yet most Americans simply don't have an understanding about the world. So they're not informed citizens, which means, among other things, they're not in a good position to hold elected officials to account. They may not know what questions to ask before they vote this November. They may not be in a position to make good investment decisions or business decisions or personal decisions or career decisions. So my goal was to essentially provide in one book in 300 plus pages, the background, the foundation that I thought somebody needed to help them navigate the news and to make more sense of the choices that are inevitably coming their way.
Real quick, before we let you go, I mean, obviously we highlighted your work under President George W. Bush there, and obviously working under Secretary of State Colin Powell. We've been highlighting the way that President Trump is trying to position himself for re-election here in an election year as this crisis unfolds, not necessarily seeing a rally around him the way that you would have thought if you are looking at this as kind of a wartime president here. Before we let you go, your take on the way that the president might not enjoy kind of the same support out there, as this is more of a health crisis than it may have been an anti-terrorism crisis that President Bush dealt with back in 2001.
Well, the reason that wartime presidents or prime ministers, if one looks like at a Churchill, do well is they level with their citizens. They don't overpromise. They try not to underdeliver. They're totally straight. They explain what's coming at them and what's likely to come at them the day after tomorrow, and they take responsibility. To quote Harry Truman, the buck stops here. Harry Truman didn't say the buck stops with the governors. So I think the president has got to take ownership of the crisis. And I think also he's got to be careful about his rush to go back to what he would consider to be economic normalcy. I get it. But the issue is not to rush to get back. It's to be able to stay back once we go back. We need to be able to sustain it. And at the moment, I'm not sure the conditions for that are even close to existing.
All right, there you go. The president of the Council on Foreign Relations since 2003, Richard Haass. Appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today, sir.
Thank you.
Hey investors, Zack Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.